Welcome to Redacted Conversations. I'm Clayton Morris. On this show, we invite journalists, thought leaders, and remarkable individuals on to talk about stories that you won't see covered in the mainstream media. Today, we're joined by Larry Johnson. He's a former longtime member of the CIA, yes, the Central Intelligence Agency. He's also a later than in his career, a member of the U.S. State Department Office of Counterterrorism. He's been exposing Western propaganda since he retired, and we have a lot to talk about on the show. Larry, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, first I want to give credit to journalist Eva Bartlett. That's how I learned about you, through her great interview that she did with you a short time ago. So I'll link that up in the show description so people can dive deeper into that. I know that you and Eva spent a lot of time discussing Ukraine and the lies that we were being fed by the Western media. So I won't retread a lot of those questions. I'll encourage all of you to go watch that full interview there. But I do want to start with you, Larry, with some context here. When did you retire from these roles in the government, just to provide a frame of reference for our audience?
Well, I was with the CIA for 4 years, 1985 to 89. I went directly from there to the State Department Office of Counterterrorism, 89 to 93. I was forced out of state because they were downsizing and cutting back on counterterrorism activities in 93. And so I started my own consulting business, and I've been doing consulting since 1993, 94. Set up Berg Associates in 1998. Had 5 partners. I still have 1 partner. And I worked with the U.S. Military Special Operations Command, U.S. Military Joint Special Operations Command, Special Operations Command, SOCOM, starting in 1994, and did that for 23 years. So that involved scripting terrorism exercises, maintaining top secret clearances, working with not just the military, but with FBI, with CIA, with the National Security Agency, NSA. So really having a broad overview of U.S. activities overseas.
Why did you start exposing the lies and the propaganda from the U.S. government? When did that start for you? Was there a moment, a catalyst that you said, people need to know about this?
Probably back in 1988, when I'm sitting in a warning meeting. So I was at the CIA. I was the senior regional analyst for Central America. And the National Intelligence Officer for Latin America at the time, Bob Vickers. And the warning meeting is to bring together, discuss all the intelligence and try to have an integrated picture. And I referred to the Contras, and Vickers stopped me and said, "Stop. You have to refer to them as the Nicaraguan Democratic Resistance." And I said, "But the president calls them the Contras." He goes, "Yeah, but he's the president." So right there, that encapsulates the problem. Once you start playing with language and start using euphemisms and refusing to actually call something what it is, I've always had that in me, that pushback. When I trained at the CIA, Valerie Plame was one of my classmates.
Wow.
When she was outed in 2003, I went on air, and I actually recruited 4 of our other classmates. We did a Nightline appearance, and we talked about Valerie, that she was not some glorified secretary, that she was in fact a non-official cover officer that was working on very sensitive issues. So I've always sort of, I guess, been a fly in the ointment as far as I don't like conventional wisdom, and I always try to look to see if what we're being told is the truth. I was in 2003, in May, I guess it was April of 2003, I was on National Public Radio with Michelle Norris, and saying that the invasion in Iraq was a complete disaster as far as lies to the American public, that it was not grounded in truth, and that there were actually people in the CIA who were arguing this, but their voices were being silenced. So across over time, I've become both, let's call it, an enemy of the right and an enemy of the left.
Right. Well, I was going to say, you're probably pissing a lot of people off. Do you ever hear from these people? Does it bother you to hear from sort of that community, or even online trolls about trying to discredit you? How do you hear from these people?
some of the trolls try. I used to be a very common face as a pundit on various cable news shows. That really ended 5 years ago. In March of 2017, I appeared on RT the day that Donald Trump claimed that the FBI was spying on him. And I commented at the time that one of the things Trump was missing is that the United Kingdom, MI6, it was GHCQ, GCHQ, were the ones spying on Trump because they could collect all of his communications and then disseminate them through intelligence channels to the U.S. intelligence community. That way it was legal. That is a legal way to spy on Americans. And boy, the media went nuts. I was pilloried, I think, on every front page of British newspaper. The real irony out of that story is back in the summer of 2007, I was actually affiliated with Hillary Clinton and her campaign through Sid Blumenthal. And Sid Blumenthal fed me a story. He said, "Hey, we got word that Michelle Obama is on tape saying the word whitey." I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah, you should check it out." So I went to 3 different people. I asked Seymour Hersh. Cy Hersh tells me, yeah, I've heard that as well. And I had 2 other confirmations of it. So I wrote up in the blog that this is what I had heard, and I had these 3 different sources. That went viral, but the tape never appeared. And so finally I kept pressing and went to Sid and said, "Where did you get this?" And he hooked me up with David Brock of Media Matters.
Oh, of Media Matters, of course. Good old David Brock, right.
So I myself, foolishly at that time, was a victim of a Clinton dirty trick because the whole notion of Michelle Obama using the term whitey was a lie.
Right. And it just sounds, it does, now you kind of think about it now, it doesn't even pass really the smell test now when you think about it, right? I'm surprised. Go ahead, sorry.
What was funny back then is that the Obama campaign put out a statement saying, no, she didn't say whitey. She said, "Why did he?" So, to me, it's like, if it's a total lie, you shouldn't even have to come out and pretend, make up some alternative story. But
yeah,
but the point was, I got used in that, and so after that, that's how we discredit Larry Johnson. He spread the whitey tape. Okay,
right.
I divulged all of that up front, and I've written apologies in my blogs to Michelle Obama over that. Well,
we all make mistakes in our career, and I think I'm pretty sure I've interviewed you. I was a news anchor at Fox News for many years and anchored a morning show called Fox and Friends.
Yes.
And I spent 10 years there with co-host with Tucker Carlson. So look, there's been a lot of things in my career that I wish I could have gone back and asked this differently or done this differently. But that's why we keep going. We're human beings and we try to get to the truth. And so, that's why I wanted to have you on. I want to start sort of at a high level regarding propaganda. Yeah. And then I want to get into some specifics of propaganda. Now, firstly, I have a history degree. I've spent years reading historiographies about propaganda during wars. Even some of my favorite books, like Ben McIntyre's spy books about World War II, like Operation Mincemeat, Agent Zigzag. He highlights quite a bit of propaganda, but I have never seen propaganda to the degree that we're seeing it out of Ukraine by the Western governments. Am I wrong here, or am I imagining this? Talk me off the ledge.
Yeah, well, no, I can't keep you off the ledge. You're gonna have to jump. It's true. My first exposure to the world of covert action was during my time in the career trainee program at CIA. We were given 8-week internships. And my first internship was working on the Afghanistan task force. And right away, they stuck us into, you get right into the middle of operations. And covert action involves planting stories, developing a narrative overseas that at that time it was pushed on television news shows, on radio and in print media, basically newspapers and magazines. And my proudest time on the covert action was we had T-shirts made up that showed all of these Afghan children and women in these refugee camps. And these T-shirts were being passed out on the beaches of Punta del Este and Montevideo in summertime. And it said, these children can't go home for Christmas. You know, it was a pathetic image. Apart from the fact that they were Muslim and didn't celebrate Christmas, that was an example of just, you know, crude, but it was one thing that was done. There were people that were being hired by the CIA to make documentaries, and they didn't realize they were being hired by the CIA. This was an era before social media. So now jump ahead to where we are today, and you're absolutely right. What is going on is staggering in terms of the amount of disinformation and lies being put out. Everything from Putin has cancer. No, he has Parkinson's disease. No, he has the heartbreak of psoriasis. I mean, it is totally absurd.
Next it'll be he's got Propecia. Then he's got.
Well, pharmaceutical companies will hire him as a spokesman and say, "Oh, I've taken all their drugs, and look, I'm still alive."
Right.
It is just the effectiveness of this campaign, though, has only been internal. It's directed against the American public to convince them to support a lie.
So that's what I wanted to get to. So where is it coming from? Obviously, you worked at the CIA. Is it coming just from there? Is it coming from the State Department? I've seen different State Department documents, so I know actually some of it's coming from there specifically. But I would imagine that there's a whole bunch of places where it's coming from. Is it a coordinated effort? And how early do they get into these planning sessions? Is this something that happens in January of 2022? Or is it something that happened last year or 2 years ago or in 2014 when we installed a puppet regime in Ukraine and mapped out this for many, many years? How far back does this go?
I don't know, but your instincts are correct as far as they didn't just wake up on February 24th and say, hey, we've got to put together a propaganda campaign, because the role of the Central Intelligence Agency in Ukraine goes back years. And the CIA played a direct role, I think, sort of a secondary role to British MI6 in the Maidan and the revolution that overthrew the elected president back in February 2014. But this CIA doesn't do it on its own. State Department doesn't do it on its own. DOD. We're not looking at rogue bureaucrats coming up with this. This reflects policy direction from the top. So this clearly comes out of the White House. I don't know who is pulling the strings at the White House. Joe Biden, I think, can barely figure out which door to go in and out of every day.
Right. I hardly believe it's coming out of his mind at this stage.
Right.
Probably, definitely a group of people around him pushing this, and it's amazing to see how coordinated it is. I mean, you drive around, you see. The other day, I was driving down to a town square, and they had all these chairs set up, and they were doing a concert for Ukraine. And I just thought, wow, it's you walk around Times Square and there's just billboards up all over the place for support Ukraine, and
right.
You wonder who's behind it, and you start looking into where the money is flowing and the messaging, and people changing all of their Twitter biographies. They put an emoji of a Ukrainian flag, and if you question this, you get trolls that just climb all over you. You're suddenly a Putin apologist if you question this narrative. And then it tries to shut down conversation.
Yeah, this is, I have never in my life seen this kind of pushback on anybody that tries to raise an alternative point of view. You remember your time, I was a Fox News analyst back in 2003. And back when they had, Major Bob Bevilacqua, and General Paul Vallely, Tom McInerney. So I was always on for the terrorism stuff. And what was ironic back then, I was of that group of former military guys, I was actually the only one who was read into the top secret classified special operations programs. They'd get on air and talk about it, but none of them were read into it. None of them had actually worked with the units I had. But even back then, there was still a room for alternative points of view allowed even on Fox.
Right.
Although I got fired ultimately by Roger Ailes because I was on Hannity and Combs. It was in November 7th, November 8th of 2002. And the question came up about the possible invasion of Iraq. And I said, the United States is not in a position to invade Iraq. We couldn't fight a two-front war. And that if we did so, it'd be a diversion into the war on terrorism. Well, Ailes sent down word, I don't want him on air anymore. And I stopped getting invites. And even though I was still under contract, and Fox, to its credit, they kept paying me every week. But they didn't put, the only one that had me on air back then was Bill O'Reilly, even after the diktat came down from Roger Ailes. So,
wow.
But what we've seen now, the only alternative voice I've seen on the U.S. media speaking against the narrative has been Colonel Douglas McGregor, and Doug has been on Tucker Carlson.
You know, I have a deep friendship with Tucker, and as we talk about, he says, look, there are literally no voices in the media that are anti-war,
Yeah.
And that's the truth. You know, and I don't want to tell tales out of school, but he's up against a mountain. He's literally one of the few voices saying, "What are we doing? We're heading towards a nuclear war." And you have members of Congress that are saying, "We want to have remove Vladimir Putin, regime change." And then, of course, over the past 24 hours, we just heard from Vladimir Zelensky in an interview on CNN saying that the only way this war ends is with the removal of Putin in Moscow. So to me, it's delusional. I don't know. And then, of course, the Western media is going to go along with it. CNN's going to push this narrative. And I don't know, what is the end game here?
Well, the propaganda campaign that we saw that was so intense in February, March, and through the middle of April, it's now backing off. It's almost like one of those commercials for Viagra that, if your sense of excitement lasts more than 3 months, see a doctor.
Right.
So, as you check the media now, and you go to the websites for Fox, for MSNBC, CNN, Ukraine, which used to be the #1 story, blaring headlines, and it is now either not there or it's down at the bottom, and it's not a very positive story. In fact, CNN last week, I was shocked to discover, had a piece about a former U.S. soldier, a special forces guy who had gone to Ukraine to fight, and all he was doing was whining and crying about, oh, it was terrible getting shelled, in 4 days it was hell, and he quit. So I'm going, oh. But that was so telling that, one, CNN would start telling that story because now they're having to come to grips with reality. Number two, it was a reminder that unless you have the positive rah-rah flag waving victory footage to show, that it is still a business about getting eyeballs to watch. And
right.
is not the good news of the victory. Instead, you've got the Azov battalion, so-called battalion, surrendering at Mariupol. And even there, the media, I guess, tipping the hat to George Orwell, called it an evacuation.
Yeah, they're evacuating into Russia, because that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many things we could unpack here. I want to talk about the sanctions, and then I want to get to some of how the media, where the money flows, and how the media positions some of these stories. But you mentioned sort of the crumbling of this narrative that's appearing on a lot of the mainstream media now, and you can see it in Reuters today and other news publications, which are absolutely in lockstep with the Ukrainian narrative. We have EU sanctions. German economic minister yesterday said that the support by the EU on sanctions against Russia are starting to crumble in the EU. Food prices are soaring across the world. So have sanctions against Russia actually worked? And I guess I already know the answer, maybe, but it appears that maybe this is where that fracturing is coming from.
Yeah, no, it's always follow the money or follow the lack of money. What I find remarkable and incomprehensible is that the people who dreamt up the idea that, boy, we're going to sanction Russia to the Stone Age had no idea or understanding of the economic realities that undergird Russia's economy. Russia is one of the few countries in the world that's self-sufficient. They, if they closed all, their people would eat. They would still be able to build advanced machinery. They'd be able to build rocket engines. You can't say that. Germany doesn't build rocket engines. Spain
Right.
doesn't build rocket engines. So, but they shut it down. But the other thing that beyond this, when I step back and look at it from an analyst point of view, can we cite one example in history and in the last 70 years where imposing economic sanctions on a country have produced regime change, political change that have helped the United States achieve its interests? And the answer to that is not a single case. Didn't work in Cuba, didn't work in Venezuela, didn't work in Iran, didn't work in North Korea, didn't work in Iran. So why in God's name do we keep going back to the well and pull this out as, oh boy, we're going to really hurt them now? Because the pain that is being caused is real. We're talking about global food shortages and starvation, famine in countries that previously had enough to eat. Why is that? Because nobody took time to assess the importance of Russia and the Ukraine in terms of wheat exports to the world. Nobody took time to examine the importance of Russia and Belarus in terms of fertilizer exports. I know from friends in Iowa that that the farmers there, they're paying 4 to 5 times what they were last year for fertilizer. They're paying double to triple for diesel fuel. Well, those costs get factored into the food, and it does a couple of things. One, it means they may not be able to plant as much as they have, which means reduced output. Two, it means whatever you produce, it's going to be far more expensive, which means that if you're buying bread, you're going to pay 2 to 3 times what you are paying now. So this is a structural source of inflation. But it's not just the food and the fertilizer, other essential minerals, earth minerals that are critical for production of, whether it's components for automobiles, the microprocessors, etc. A lot of that comes out of Russia too. That's cut off. So the West has done such enormous damage to itself. And then there's the oil and gas, which you've got BMW and the heads of German automobile companies saying that they could be done producing automobiles in 3 months. I mean, think about that Volkswagen, wow, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, kaputt, and to speak it in German. So the ramifications of this is sort of like an asteroid hitting the Earth and the ripple effect that goes around the globe, killing and creating secondary damage. This is a metaphorical asteroid that's hit the world economy. So it's not just Russia's the one who's actually largely unscathed out of this. It is the West, Europe in particular, United States, Latin America, South America, that are going to suffer the ramifications of this. And nobody's really, there's this assumption that there's always somebody really smart in the government and the intelligence community that sits down and thinks these things through so that they know what's going on. It doesn't exist. For 3 or 4 years, from 2000 into like 2004, I was part of a team that did a senior crisis management seminar under the State Department's anti-terrorism assistance training program. In this seminar, we trained people from other countries. So it'd be, say they'd come from Cyprus or from Colombia or Saudi Arabia. We did Saudi Arabia, Pakistan. It'd be one country per seminar. And I came to discover that all of these foreigners, it didn't matter whether they were from South America, from the Middle East, or from Asia, they all believed that the United States had some sort of secret that we were keeping from them. And this was particularly in reference to the war in Iraq. They assumed that we really were not that stupid, that we had some devious plot that we weren't sharing with them, because they figured that we thought like they thought, that they would hide stuff from us and lie about true intentions. And I had to say, no, this the war in Iraq in 2003 was not some part of some grand strategy. It was much more, they really thought that they could go in and install democracy and make the world a better place to live. It was that simple and that stupid. And so the foreigners, they understood, or they didn't understand that we don't understand. And so when you come back to it, there's nobody in the U.S. government that's sitting down and thinking these things through and say, what will be the second, third, fourth consequences of this particular action? Thinking like a chess player. We're a country that plays poker. We're a country that likes to gamble. We're not a country known for its great chess players, apart from Bobby Fischer.
It's interesting when you say that, because I think about the propaganda campaigns then. And again, I'm sitting back thinking, man, these, as I said before, these things must be cooked up for years. They must be whiteboards with pieces of yarn with pins attached to things, building a web of deceit. And is that how it goes when they're building sort of these disinformation campaigns and propaganda? Is it that thought out, or is it more like you say, more like, you know what, we've got this one idea, we're going to play poker here and call their bluff? There
are plans developed. The counterterrorism exercises I worked on over 23 years. So my role in that was I was to script, create State Department messages, both messages going from the Secretary of State and messages coming in from the U.S. embassies overseas. And you create the information background that would then justify a military deployment by special operations forces to deal with a particular threat, whether it was a sarin attack or anthrax or a nuclear bomb, or we did a whole variety of scenarios. What I found fascinating out of that is at the conclusion of each of these exercises, so we do the scripting, and then the exercises would actually be executed in point, say 3 to 6 months later. At the conclusion of those exercises, there would always be what's called a hot wash or an after action report, where people would sit around and say, okay, what did we learn from this? What did we do wrong? Or what could we do better? And I quickly discovered that everyone this was the best exercise ever. Nobody's ever done this better than us. And there were no lessons learned. They would come up with a list, but nobody paid attention to those lists. Nobody went back and reviewed them. So I imagine there are actually written plans that have been put together. Some, what CIA would do for itself, what DOD would do through its PSYOPs commands. Throughout the government, there are documents about how to push a particular message. But in terms of having it tightly coordinated, I think it should happen, but it doesn't always happen like you think it should, because the bureaucracy is vast, and people they become very task oriented about what's in front of us today. Again, I was never involved. Well, in fact, in 2003, let's go back to the war in Iraq. Nobody ever sat down and said, okay, where do we want Iraq to be in 5 years? What should this look like? What's that plan? How do we get from here to there? So that kind of strategic thinking I have never seen in my time in exposure to the U.S. government. And I did hold top secret clearances. I did hold compartmented clearances. And I had the advantage of worked in CIA, worked at state, worked closely with FBI, worked with the military. So I've been in sort of all the different tents that comprise the U.S. government city, and didn't see that.
Earlier this week, or actually I should say last week, at the Department of Defense, we had General Milley and we had Lloyd Austin giving a speech. There were a variety of topics were discussed. One question, though, was asked by a reporter specifically about, like, what's the end game here for Ukraine? You know, and how do we, what's the goal? How do we declare sort of a victory, or how do we understand that this is a mission complete and that this is a success? So back to your Iraq analogy, do you think that there is a plan? What Ukraine is supposed to look like in 5 years if we continue to pour $40 billion of weapons into that country? Has anyone thought through what this is going to look like years from now?
No, there won't be a Ukraine in 5 years. The way this war is grinding on right now, Ukraine's ability to stay intact as a country is, I think, in grave doubt. Number one, they've lost their economic. Think of it as arteries that flow into a heart. So one of the major arteries is what comes up from the southern coast, from the Black Sea. That's a major economic outlet for both imports, exports via container ships. That's gone, not coming back. Russia's got that under control. I fully expect Russia to take control of Odessa sometime within the next 2 to 3 months, maybe sooner. But Russia they already have de facto control of the southern coast. There is nothing that comes in and out of there unless Russia approves it. So you lose that enormous chunk. The ability to get food and critical resources is dependent really on what goes across the border with Poland. And there is an actual physical limitation to how many trains, how many trucks can go back and forth. And so in the course of that, the economy in Ukraine is going to be contracting. They're going to be constantly demanding more money from the West. Right now, people have been willing to give, but that's starting to end. If you look at what's happening in places like Austria and even Poland, they're starting to push Ukrainian refugees out. You know, before they were welcoming them and waving the yellow and blue flag and singing their praises. Now they're kicking them out of hotels and saying, "Get out of here." And some of these Ukrainian refugees are proving to be very unwelcome guests. You know, they're beating people up in the streets. So as Ukraine's needs economically are not going to go away, they're going to grow. And they're not going to have the internal ability to get that, to produce the money, to grow food, to these major manufacturing centers that used to exist. They're going to be largely under the control of Russia going forward. So this gets back to were they thinking of the plan, I believe, that Austin and others have articulated, that they would force Russia's hand, that it would have no other alternative. They would have to surrender, and that Putin would be gone, that the economic pressure would be so great on Russia that they would collapse. The opposite's going to happen. That's going to happen to the Ukraine. Zelensky very well could be ousted in a coup within the next 3 to 4 weeks because of the great disgruntlement among troops on the Eastern Front. At that point, Russia is intact. The United States is going to have to figure out how do we back away from drawing this red line in the sand, because Russia is a genuine world power from an economic and military standpoint. China cannot do militarily what Russia does. Yeah, China has a lot more, men to throw into the military, but they technologically are not up to the same level that Russia is. And Americans forget, for years there, we were having to rely upon Russia to fly our sorry asses to the space station because we couldn't produce our own rockets.
Right.
And yet we disparage Russia as a backward country of a bunch of ignorant Slavs. It's just ridiculous.
You brought up China, and that's where I want to go next. So over the past few days, we heard from Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, who gave a big speech on China and talked about this being the main focus for the United States, that forget Russia. I mean, and it's amazing to even hear him say, he's like, forget Russia. China is the main focus, and we're not going to back down from China. We're going to stand up to the sphere of influence that China is trying to create in the Indo-Pacific, and that should be our main focus now. So I want to kind of unpack the China question.
Sure.
And where do you see the propaganda? Where's the truth, actually? Let's get to the truth here. Is China, I hear from people in my YouTube comments like, you don't know what you're talking about. China's about to attack the United States. You better listen to Antony Blinken. You better listen. They're about to attack the United States. And then other people say, this is absolute fear-mongering by the United States. So where is the truth in this?
China is a threat. Always has been. But just because it's a potential threat to our interests doesn't mean that you have to go to war with them. I believe part of what's unfolding is the United States is, again, the provocateur here, and we're doing it in such a crazy way. We're not as strong and as powerful as we think. We are delusional in that regard. We think our military, that we can withstand anything the Chinese throw at us. The entire premise of U.S. power projection in the Pacific is based upon our naval force carrier task force. Well, those carrier task force in the past, they could withstand conventional missile threats. We're now in the era of hypersonic missiles. The aircraft carrier is completely vulnerable to a hypersonic missile. And my understanding is the Chinese have some, and the Russians certainly have some, and would be more than happy to supply the Chinese with them if they felt that there was really an existential threat from the United States. So at that point, when you take out all aircraft carriers, what's the United States? What's our option left? A nuclear strike on China?
We could get Doolittle again from World War II, and
and again, that the Doolittle raid, it made Americans feel good. It didn't really do much damage.
Exactly.
You guys killed, but it made us. It's part of that propaganda meme. It feeds into it. I think China is being extremely shrewd right now, and they're not looking for a direct military confrontation with the United States. Look at the lockdown that's taken place in Shanghai because of COVID.
Right.
It does not make sense, particularly in light of how China dealt with the COVID threat the previous 2 years. They never had that kind of massive lockdown of any of their major cities. Now, all of a sudden, we've got the COVID, we got to lock it down. Well, why is Shanghai important? Shanghai is a critical hub for economic activity with the United States. And in locking down that city, it locked down and stopped the flow of critical economic elements to the United States. In a way, this is another source of pain for the U.S. economy. We haven't seen it fully manifested yet. So this is a way that China can engage in economic warfare without declaring economic warfare. They can say, we'd love to help you, but boy, we got this COVID and we got to contain it. Just like, you've locked down your society, we got to lock ours down.
Right. I mean, they can say, hey, all those Foxconn plants that make all your iPhones, we saw a rash of COVID sweeping through those Foxconn plants. So sorry, I know you want iPhones, but you're probably not going to get them because we saw COVID there. That's a great point. I have really not thought about that at all.
Well, and Tesla as well. Tesla
right.
has a major manufacturing center there in Shanghai. I believe China is now pushing back with through economic means, carrying out the warfare on that front that they can accomplish through those. Once the United States is weakened, once we're in the throes of hyperinflation, which I believe is a real possibility within the next 6 months to a year, once our economy is starting to crater, and I live in the west coast of Florida, just south of Tampa. The real estate market here has been insane. It was such that you didn't even have to put a house on the market for it to sell. people were lined up and just it would start selling. What's happened in the last 2 weeks? Houses in my neighborhood, which is a highly desired place to live, house has now been on the market for 2 weeks. That's unheard of, and it is the prices have literally doubled. Well, that's starting to cool. So it started here in the States, and so China, I think, is counting on the fact that if the United States is economically weakened, then they will be at liberty to do what they want to do in terms of pursuing what they see as their legitimate claim over Taiwan. So I don't necessarily see it going towards the military confrontation. They could. And I do know for a fact that the United States, our Pacific Command, PACOM, that they have been taking some provocative actions out in the East China Sea that sort of tempting the Chinese to push back. The problem for the United States is that we grossly exaggerate our military capability. We've lived in just self-delusion over the last 32 years because everybody we fought is the equivalent of a crippled kid in a wheelchair. We've never actually fought somebody who could stand on both feet and have both arms and is a trained fighter. We fought Iraq, we fought the folks in Somalia, we fought the Afghans, and frankly, we didn't win any of those conflicts.
Right. I mean, look what happened in Somalia. I mean, the reason Bill Clinton got out because of what happened in Mogadishu. My brother was there at the time, or shortly before that. It was a mess. So you're right about that. I've thought a lot about that. You mentioned in an interview with Eva Bartlett about we haven't fought a real foe since basically Korea, and that really struck a chord with me. And you think about Vietnam, you think about Somalia, you think about Iraq, you think about these countries with no air power, and then you see what's happening in Russia, where they're just absolutely ripping apart entire bunkers and entire trenches that the Ukrainians have set up and wiping out anything that they have to fight back.
Now, I'd love to take credit for being brilliant in coming up with this on my own, but Andrei Martyanov has written an absolutely brilliant book. I mean, it really is must read. It's called Losing Military Supremacy, the Myopia of American Strategic Planning. And Andre lays this out chapter and verse. I mean, it's just, his insights are just really astounding.
I'll make sure we link that up in the description. I'm confounded though. I mean, I have friends in the military. I have friends at the Pentagon. I have friends in NATO. I have, all manners. I have family members who were, in Iraq. So the amount of money that the United States spends to have this so-called greatest military in the world, President Biden just $800 billion, and Americans can't buy eggs. And you're pointing to this book, and I just don't know what the disconnect is. Like, where is this money going if it's not actually going to build up this massive military industrial force to be reckoned with, where we can't even fight one war, let alone a two-front war?
Well, it's the inherent corruption that's in Washington, D.C. Were you based in Washington, or were you up in New York?
I was in New York City, yeah.
So I first moved to the Washington, D.C. area in Maryland back in 1979. When I arrived there at the time, you did not have a single Lamborghini, Ferrari, Bentley dealership in the area. You didn't have a row of luxury stores, on par with what you'd see in Beverly Hills. Now it's populated. You can get a Ferrari, you can get a Lamborghini, you can get the high-end luxury items. Well, what does Washington, D.C. produce? Nothing but access to people who can allocate a lot of money for a lot of contractors. And the buildings that line the Dulles toll road going from Washington, D.C. out to Dulles Airport are just, it's contractor canyon. So what's happened is this corruption of money, where the defense industry buys off generals who come out of the Pentagon, and then they go onto their boards, and then they get their buddies, and then we're able to go back and sell weaponry. And I live next door to the largest defense lobbyist in Washington, D.C., and it was all about getting the right member of Congress member of Congress needs money for their campaign, so these corporations will spill out the money to them, and it becomes a self-licking ice cream cone. So instead of actually creating military hardware technology that's critical for national defense, it's really you get the exotic. So we're now in a situation, and let's compare it back to World War II. What the Germans created, these massive tanks like the Panther. They were huge, but they took a long time to build. They were very complex mechanically, and once they got out into the field, they broke down. So yes, it was a big, huge tank, and it could destroy 10 Russian T-34 tanks. The difference, though, Russia was able to produce 1,000 T-34 tanks in a day. Think about that.
Wow.
So it was the difference between having all this high-end weaponry that it was not necessarily reliable, and let's call it low-end crap that actually worked and would keep on ticking even after getting a licking. And that's exactly the position the United States military is in today. Look at the F-35.
Right.
I forget, it cost, was it $90 million? And yet the flight, every hour it operates, you have to spend another $35,000 an hour to keep that plane in the air. So right away, you're talking about an enormous expenditure of resources for just one plane. The reality is we shouldn't have manned aircraft anymore that are combat fighters, because the drone technology has come so far that you can fly those planes remotely. And the second element is those planes can perform at levels that if they do not have a human occupant, they're much more, they can do a lot more dynamic activity. But because you have to have a human being in it, you've got to go through all these safety systems that end up adding to the cost of the plane. So we're in a situation in which we've invested so much money in military hardware that has been outpaced by technology. And I gave an example earlier, the hypersonic missile. Aircraft carriers no longer are invulnerable. They are very vulnerable, and 12 hypersonic missiles could take out the bulk of the U.S. naval force, and we can't build that carrier in a week, bringing on new carriers on board.
Wow. All
of a sudden, the United States military ability to project force through naval activity is eliminated. So this is the equivalent of the introduction of the machine gun back when we had horse cavalry. The horse cavalry became irrelevant. It was no longer relevant because the machine gun could kill it more quickly. And that's sort of a situation we're in now. We've invested so heavily in military equipment and hardware that, candidly doesn't work that well. And they're actually seeing that a little bit on the field in Ukraine. We've sent thousands of Javelin missiles, and Stinger missiles, and they're not decimating the Russian military as often been claimed in the media.
No, and then they just reordered new ones overnight. I just saw a new huge order for almost $700 million for a new round of Stinger missiles. So the money keeps flowing, even though they're not working.
Yeah, and that's to replenish our stocks.
Right.
And when you sit down and realize that the Stinger missile is a 42-year-old piece of technology. I mean, it was created in 1980. So, and it was used originally to shoot down helicopters, which the helicopters since then have developed some, the Russians are putting out some helicopters with pretty effective countermeasures. So the Stingers don't always work that well. What they do work on is commercial aircraft, and that we've lost control of the Stingers in the Ukraine. The Ukrainian criminal organizations have certainly got their hands on them, And there are lots of other organizations out around the world that would love to get a stinger and use it for their own purposes.
Well, even CNN, of all news organizations, a few weeks ago reported that we can't keep track of where these weapons wind up in the field. When they get there, we don't really have an accurate way of tracking them. And I saw a separate report which confirms what you're just talking about, that these Stinger missiles, when they arrive in theater, I mean, so many other countries have gotten their hands on these things, so-called enemies of the United States, to your point. And I think a number of commercial aircraft have already been shot down. Is that not correct? With American missiles, with American weapons?
I'm not aware of that. I couldn't come up with a list. You may be right, but it hasn't been that common. It's the kind of thing that could become more common going forward. Again, it's not a terribly complicated technology to learn how to use, but there still has to be some training.
Right.
Yeah, I recall, it was January of '86. The United States, we brought mujahideen from Afghanistan to America to learn how to shoot the Stingers
Against the Russians, right? Right.
Training was being conducted at a particular top secret base. I was actually at that base at the time. So.
One of the things I wanted to touch on before we get you out of here is, this idea of a conspiracy theory. I mean, it sounds conspiratorial to talk about the United States moving towards a civil war, but we had a viewer during one of our live shows say to us, the term conspiracy theory came from the CIA. We separately looked it up and we said that seemed to be the case. And I wanted to confirm with you, who having worked at the CIA, first of all, is that where that term comes from, conspiracy theory? Does it come out of the CIA?
Yeah, I've never looked into the origins of it. I guess my take on the I call it a pejorative, conspiracy theory, because it is a pejorative used to try to discredit what is actually true. Yeah, there are, people will generate conspiracies, and they're always very elaborate, assumed a high level of coordination and intricacy. Just what I know from my own time in government is the government has a very difficult time keeping secrets. And I learned early on in my days at CIA, we'd be getting briefed on information. Now, this is top secret information. Don't share this. Next day or two, it was in the front page of the Washington Post or New York Times. So it was being leaked. And I came to understand that when classified information is being put out, it's usually because there's a policy difference. And this is one way that the bureaucracy has of fighting its battle, by putting that information out in public. There's also, when there's agreement on a particular policy or approach, that information rarely leaks. I recall in the early days what's now called the Foreign Emergency Support Team. It's out unclassified. It's an interagency response team for dealing with a terrorist incident. Well, when I first started working on it back in 1989, it was top secret. But, nobody discussed it. We came close to having it exposed in the summer of 1990 when that team had responded to a coup in Trinidad and Tobago, just on the eve of the invasion of Iraq by Saddam Hussein. And one reporter got wind of it, and we were able to talk that reporter out of publishing the story, which they did not publish.
Wow.
So what I find fascinating is, like, for example, when I was saying in 2017 that there was a coordinated U.S. government effort to discredit Donald Trump, I was accused of being a conspiracy theorist. Well, we now know that's true, because what I was being told at the time, CIA started in 2015 under John Brennan. They literally were spying, not just on Trump, because remember, Trump, there's no guarantee that Trump is going to be the nominee, but they were literally collecting intelligence. And the way the CIA would do this is through foreign liaison. So the CIA, in theory, cannot spy on Americans. But by God, the Brits can, and the Dutch can, and the Germans can. So we go to those intelligence services, give them a list of requirements of who to collect information on, They collect that information. They produce intelligence reports that are then shared through liaison channels. Well, the CIA can certainly receive foreign intelligence, and just because it happens to be about American citizens, they'll block the name out even though they know what the names are. They were collecting information on Ted Cruz and on Bernie Sanders, of all things. So this was in 2015.
Wow.
And as time went on, as the campaign consolidated, and when it became clear that Donald Trump was going to be the nominee, that's when the whole focus came together, I think, around end of December, January of 2016 to go after it. Now, I was hearing about this from a friend of mine in the CIA. One guy was approached, he was tapped on the shoulder, he's asked if he wanted to be part of what they called the Trump Task Force. And he said, no. They literally brought together an interagency organization to collect information on Donald Trump to try to destroy him.
Wow.
Now, people say, you're a conspiracy theorist. Well, dude, that's what was going on. And guess what we start learning this week from Robbie Mook? Yeah, the whole Russia thing was ginned up by the Hillary Clinton campaign. Well, no kidding. I wrote about that 5 years ago. You had John Podesta communicating with a fellow up on the Hill named Budowski. And Mr. Budowski was talking, he said in a December email to Podesta, we need to beat up Donald Trump over his bromance with Vladimir Putin. So it was clearly a part of their campaign strategy back then. So this back to your broader question. The use of the term conspiracy theory, at least in the West right now, is always a pejorative designed to attack somebody who's more often than not telling the truth.
Right. We have a saying here on our show, and we didn't come up with it, but it came from a viewer, I believe. Conspiracy theories are simply spoiler alerts.
Yeah.
six months later, they end up coming true, right? Well, and we talked. I kind of touched on this idea of civil war, and I don't want it to sound like a conspiracy theory, but when you see what's happening in the United States right now, you see these massive divisions, and more to the point, not even just like cultural divisions, but you see rampant poverty, and you see inflation, and you see what the government is doing. It has all of the hallmarks of what like Jared Diamond writes about in his book Collapse, or others have studied studied empires that have collapsed. There's a lot of similarities here. Are we ignoring history and simply just labeling it a conspiracy theory, or do you see some signs, some seeds right now that the United States is heading in that direction?
Anybody that has studied history would see some eerie, unwelcome parallels with what is going on right now in the United States with, say, the lead up to the Civil War in the 1860s. At that time, the issue was really states' rights. It wasn't slavery per se. Slavery was one of the elements that was fighting against. But we've got the cultural civil war is definitely underway. Michael
Chertoff, former head of Homeland Security, public liar. We saw what happened with Nina Jankowicz, who was going to be heading up this disinformation governance board under the Department of Homeland Security. She was outed for spreading disinformation herself about Russiagate. Well, I was really worried that the real story here, now that she was ousted, like people would forget about this, because now Michael Chertoff is basically going to run the show and take over where she is not, running this disinformation governance board. So it's not going away. Can you speak about Michael Chertoff and maybe why we need to be more concerned now than we were before with this Nina Jankowicz?
Yeah, the big difference is Chertoff is competent. She wasn't, and he's dangerous. Remember, Chertoff was one of the signatories to the letter claiming that the Hunter Biden laptop was possible Russian disinformation.
Right.
I mean, absolute lie. So the irony here is the guy that's been putting out disinformation is right in the middle. I mean, I'm friend. I don't know if you know this or not, but I'm friends with J.P. McIsaac, the laptop repairman.
Oh.
I met him through his father, and when all of this story started breaking, I helped JP get his security and his legal team in place because he was sort of on his own at the time. But the laptop is absolutely 100% true, and his story is 100% true. And yet here's Chertoff, just recently, within the last 2 weeks, still insisting that it's Russian disinformation. I mean, the man, he is a malevolent force in government, and it's shown that he has absolutely zero principles. He will lie about anything.
It's terrifying. I mean, it's terrifying to think that this is, he's going to put the stamp of approval on what the American people are able to digest as actual and factual information. Good that Michael Chertoff is going to be there telling us what is disinformation from the man who spreads disinformation.
Again, these people that are pushing this nonsense, they don't understand history. So even during the darkest days of the Cold War and when the Soviet Union was at the height of its power, they could not stop the spread of information. That whole thing is samizdat. Where books were circulating and underground speeches. And so you try to clamp down, it's impossible. Yeah, it creates some real trouble on regular media. But the fact of the matter is people have abandoned regular media. If you recall, I did a comparison in 1968 in August during that presidential campaign. The number of viewers total for ABC, CBS, NBC was like 56 million a night for that news show. Well, now, and of that, Walter Cronkite accounted for like 27, 28 million. So he had more than the other two combined. Jump ahead to August 2016. I looked at the ratings for the various news shows, ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fox, MSNBC, CNN. All of those stations combined were getting like 27 million viewers.
Wow.
So it is, but within that, there's a level of ignorance among the population too. They don't know who fought in World War II.
Right.
You couldn't, if you asked them to identify Churchill, they go, they think maybe you're talking about a racetrack in Kentucky.
Right.
No, the separation of the public from the media, or the media's separation of itself from the public, is it's failed to perform its education. And what it is educating now is propaganda. And most people, turn it off. So they're really going to alternative sources. And again, that's why I think shows like what you do are important. It puts something else out there, and if you get it up on a variety of platforms like BitChute and Rumble, that you're not confined to just one, it's important. We didn't have this 20 years ago. When I first started blogging, the concept of YouTube was in its very, very its infancy. And so people were doing it the old-fashioned way. They literally record some program on television and then figure out how to transfer it to their computer. But now, this stuff is miraculous what can be done in terms of people broadcasting their own information. But you have to be thoughtful. You have to sort through it and say, is this person lying to me, or are they feeding me a load of crap?
Right. Yeah, and we were shut down a couple of times covering both Ukraine, revealing the truth about what was happening in Mariupol and as well as Bucha, and we got shut down for it. We were also shut down for covering Pfizer's own documents, reading from their own documents, and that was labeled medical misinformation, yet this was literally their own paperwork. But that's what happens with big tech, and then that's why we made a big push on Rumble and other platforms to make sure that we're protected in case that happens again. But Larry, where can people find you? Where can people read what you're working on, and the thoughts that you're putting out into the world to bring us information that we can't get other places?
I write at Sonar, SONAR 21.com. That's where I blog. I try to put up a piece a day.
We'll make sure we have that linked up in the show description. So sonar21.com. And Larry, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I could talk to you all day. I have so many more questions, but we'll have you back here on the show. And I really appreciate you taking some time out to dive in and to cut through some of this propaganda and some of the lies that people are being fed right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Clayton.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.